Beneath the shattered pavement of Cologne, the air in the subterranean air raid shelter smells of cold concrete, terror-induced sweat, and wet plaster. A young teenager, huddled tightly against a damp wall, feels the deep, low-frequency vibration of hundreds of heavy aircraft engines reverberating directly through the bedrock. To the civilians shivering in the dark, and to the exhausted flak gunners scanning the horizons from their concrete towers, the Allied air war presented two entirely distinct faces of ruin. They feared the glittering American armadas that filled the noon daylight sky, bringing a sterile daylight precision that systematically dismantled their war machine. But they dreaded the invisible British Lancasters that haunted the pitch-black night, bringing a psychological horror that rained firestorms until the asphalt melted and the very air was consumed. It was a terrifying contrast between a fightable, visible adversary by day and the claustrophobic, unseen annihilation that stalked the night. Today, we uncover the shocking truth about U.S. and British battlefield dominance. This operational divergence was not an accident of geography, but a deep ideological schism born in the decades between the world wars. At the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama, American theorists had developed a near-religious faith in daylight precision bombardment. Led by visionary commanders like Brigadier General Ira Eaker, the Americans believed that modern industrial societies possessed vital key nodes, power plants, ball bearing factories, oil refineries, whose destruction would instantly paralyze the enemy's entire war effort. To achieve this surgical extraction, they relied on the legendary top-secret Norden bomb sight, an analog computer of breathtaking complexity that pilots swore could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. But daylight was non-negotiable for such precision. The bombardier had to see the target through the optical glass. Thus, young American crews in heavy sheepskin jackets climbed into their B-17 flying fortresses at dawn, shivering in the sub-zero temperatures of high altitude, where their breath froze into solid ice on their oxygen masks, relying on massive mutual defense combat box formations and hundreds of heavy 50-caliber machine guns to fight their way through the German fighter defense. Across the airfields of eastern England, the Royal Air Force viewed this American daylight idealism with a mixture of respect and deep battle-tested cynicism. The British had entered the war with similar illusions of daytime precision, only to have them brutally shattered. In December 1939, during a daylight raid over the Heligoland Bight, heavily armed Vickers Wellingtons were utterly slaughtered by nimble German Messerschmitt fighters, proving that unescorted bombers could never survive the daytime skies. When the landmark Butt Report of August 1941 revealed that only one-third of RAF bombers were managing to drop their payloads within 5 miles of their intended targets in the dark, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris reached a grim, pragmatic conclusion. Precision was an impossible fantasy in the face of modern air defenses. Instead, the RAF would embrace the night, utilizing the massive carrying capacity of the Avro Lancaster to unleash area bombardment. This was not a war of surgical strikes, but of total industrial attrition, designed to dehouse the German industrial workforce and shatter the collective morale of the Third Reich under a blanket of absolute darkness. This fundamental split in strategy meant that while American crews prepared to look their enemy in the eye by day, the British set out to haunt them in their sleep. To counter this dual-headed onslaught, the German air defense network, known as the Reichsverteidigung, was forced to split its tactical soul. Against the daytime American threat, the Luftwaffe deployed heavily armed day fighters, their pilots climbing into the bright morning sky to execute head-on attacks designed to shatter the nerve of the B-17 bomber crews. Yet as the sun dipped below the horizon, this daytime defense was utterly useless. To combat the British night bombers, Germany erected the Kammhuber Line, a vast, intricate belt of searchlights, sound locators, and radar stations stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. In darkened command bunkers, female operators, known as Flakhelferinnen, pushed wooden markers across giant plotting tables, guiding specialized night fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-110, equipped with bizarre antler-like radar antennas, through the pitch black to hunt down the British bomber stream. This split-screen war of attrition took an immense physical and psychological toll on the defenders on the ground. By 1943, the veteran gunners of the Luftwaffe had been bled white on the Eastern Front, leaving the defense of the homeland to the Flakhelfer, schoolboys as young as 15 wearing oversized helmets and shivering in concrete gun emplacements. These children lived in a state of perpetual, exhausting whiplash. By day, they squinted into the glare of the noon sun, tracking the immaculate silver geometry of the American formations through optical rangefinders, while high explosive shells detonated in black puffs of smoke at 25,000 feet. By night, those same boys were blinded by the wild, sweeping beams of searchlights, deafened by air raid sirens, and choked by the sulphurous smoke of their own guns as they fired blindly into a dark abyss that felt alive with hidden predators. The German defensive apparatus was being ground down by two entirely different gears of the Allied industrial machine, setting the stage for the ultimate test of human endurance in the skies above the fatherland. For the German citizen on the ground, the American arrival was a spectacle of terrifying clinical visibility. There was no hiding from the U.S. 8th Air Force. When the sirens wailed at 10 in the morning, the population didn't search the darkness. They looked up, shielding their eyes against the glare of the sun to witness the Silver Armada. Thousands of B-17s, organized into perfectly locked combat boxes, droned across the sky with a mechanical, rhythmic regularity that felt less like a military strike and more like a force of nature. For the factory worker in Schweinfurt or the engineer at a ball-bearing plant, the American style brought a unique form of psychological dread, the realization that they were being watched by an enemy who could see everything. The Norden bomb sight was not just a tool for accuracy, it was a symbol of an industrial power that could isolate and delete a specific factory, while the city around it might, for a fleeting hour, remain largely intact. It felt cold, detached, and surgically efficient. For the flak gunner, the Americans provided a visible target, a tactical puzzle to be solved. You could see the enemy, you could track the formation, you could calculate the lead. But that visibility was the cruelest part of the illusion. The gunners would spend minutes frantically cranking the elevation gears, watching their 88mm shells climb into the blue, only to see the American formation remain unmoved, an unstoppable glacial monolith in the sky. To be a gunner beneath the American Big Week was to endure the frustration of knowing that your best efforts were often falling thousands of feet short of the mark. The B-17s were heavily armed, buzzing with lethal 50-caliber machine guns, making the air around the flak towers feel alive with incoming fire. It was a duel. You could see the enemy you were trying to kill, and they could see you. This made the American raids feel like a grand, high-stakes tournament where the German defender was perpetually losing, trapped in a cycle of mechanical failure and visible, agonizing defeat. The fear here was of a system that functioned with the precision of a clock, indifferent to the chaos they created below, grinding the industrial capability of Germany down, one factory at a time, in the cold, bright light of day. But as the sun set, this disciplined, fightable threat would vanish, and the true, shapeless horror of the night would begin to descend upon the city. When the RAF Lancaster bomber stream arrived, the nature of the fear shifted from frustration to primal, blind panic. Unlike the Americans, who announced their presence with the drone of thousands of engines in the daylight, the British arrived in a darkness so absolute it felt unnatural. For the civilians in Hamburg or Dresden, the night brought an oppressive, stifling silence, followed by the terrifying realization that they were being hunted by a ghost. There was no sky to look up into. There was only the suffocating pressure of being trapped in a cellar while an invisible ceiling of fire began to drop. The British didn't just bomb factories, they saturated entire neighborhoods with Pathfinder flares. Vivid, colored lanterns hum in the sky like grotesque lanterns, signaling exactly where the next wave of blockbusters should fall. It felt personal, relentless, and completely inescapable. The flak gunners, in particular, found the RAF night raids to be an experience of utter madness. In the dark, the searchlights were often more of a liability than an asset, occasionally silhouetting their own gun positions for the unseen bombers above. The German gunners could not aim at what they could not see. They were firing at sounds, at radar ghosts, or at the faint flickering exhaust flames of engines high above the cloud layer. Every explosion in the city below wasn't just a hit on an industrial node, it was the birth of a firestorm. The British tactic of mixing high explosives designed to blow off roofs and shatter windows with thousands of small magnesium-based incendiaries meant that once the raid began, the city itself became the weapon. The fires would grow, feeding on the oxygen until they reached a critical mass, creating a feuerstorm or firestorm, where the very atmosphere was sucked into the inferno. The horror for the German defender was the realization that they were not fighting an army. They were witnessing the systematic incineration of their world by an invisible hand they could neither see, nor touch, nor stop. It wasn't the sterile, fightable duel of the American day. It was the dark, soul-crushing despair of a civilization being erased by an invisible hand. The sheer, relentless divergence of these two air campaigns forced a profound operational evolution within the German High Command, and conversely necessitated a pragmatic synthesis from the Allies. As 1944 dawned, the relentless grinding pressure of American daylight precision combined with the catastrophic fire-driven erasure of British night area bombing began to force the Luftwaffe into a terminal crisis. The German leadership could no longer afford to treat the air war as two separate problems. They were trapped in a vice. If they optimized their fighter defenses for the heavily armored, day-flying B-17 combat boxes, they were essentially defenseless against the elusive, night-flying Lancaster streams. Conversely, strengthening their night fighter wings to track the RAF through the dark left their industrial centers exposed to the surgical daylight dismantling performed by the U.S. 8th Air Force. This double bind forced the German Luftwaffe to spread their resources, aircraft, and experienced pilot training so thin that by the time the Allies reached the shores of Normandy, the skies over the fatherland were increasingly dominated by inexperienced boys and increasingly obsolete airframes. The German defensive strategy had, quite literally, been fragmented by the two-pronged approach of its enemies. The most critical turning point in this tactical interplay arrived with the full-scale deployment of the long-range escort fighter, most notably the P-51 Mustang. This development essentially closed the loop on the American daylight strategy, finally allowing the U.S. to take the fight directly to the German day fighter wings in their own backyard. By forcing the Luftwaffe to engage in a decisive head-to-head battle of attrition over Germany, the Americans did more than just protect their bombers. They broke the back of the German fighter force. This shift, combined with the British RAF's mastery of the night and their ability to saturate the German infrastructure, created a total war environment where no industrial node, no transport network, and no urban center was truly safe, day or night. The German defensive apparatus was no longer just strained, it was completely uncoupled, unable to keep pace with an enemy that had perfected the art of occupying the sky 24 hours a day, simultaneously demanding total defense while offering no vulnerability to defend. By the summer of 1944, the ideological debates between precision and area bombing had largely been superseded by the cold, hard logic of the oil campaign. General Karl Spaatz and Air Chief Marshal Harris, despite their differing philosophies, recognized that the Reich's circulatory system, synthetic fuel and oil, was the one target that mattered above all others. For the German High Command, this was the beginning of the end. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later remarked in his memoirs that the American daylight raids on the Luna refinery were more decisive than any other blow of the war. While the Americans hit the machinery with clinical accuracy by day, the RAF returned by night to sow chaos and destroy the surrounding infrastructure, ensuring that ground crews and repair workers had no respite. This around-the-clock bombardment meant that repair efforts were perpetually interrupted by firestorms and blockbusters, turning the reconstruction of vital plants into a Sisyphean nightmare. The German war machine wasn't just being broken, it was being starved of the very lifeblood required to keep its tanks rolling and its planes in the air. In the face of this total aerial dominance, German tactics devolved into a desperate, frantic pursuit of wonder weapons. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, represented a final high-tech hope to break the Allied formations. Yet even this technological marvel was neutered by the Allied strategy. The jets needed fuel, which was being incinerated in the refineries, and they needed experienced pilots, most of whom were already dead or exhausted. To survive the rain of fire, the Reich attempted the impossible, moving entire industrial cities underground. In the damp, dark tunnels of the Mittelwerk, thousands of slave laborers were forced to assemble rockets and jet engines beneath a mountain of stone. But the Americans and British simply shifted their focus to the transport networks, bombing the rail lines and bridges that connected these subterranean factories to the front. The German soldier on the ground found himself in a paradox, fighting for a state that could still produce advanced weaponry but could no longer deliver it to the battlefield. The sense of an inevitable descending doom became the primary psychological condition of the German people, a realization that neither the light of day nor the shadow of night offered any further sanctuary. This total collapse of the German environment was the ultimate legacy of the combined bomber offensive. The hammer and anvil effect, the American precision sledgehammer hitting the industry by day, and the British area anvil crushing the morale and urban fabric by night, produced a result neither could have achieved alone. It was a brutal industrial synergy that turned the German interior into a second front, one where the casualties were counted in city blocks, and the front lines were the charred remains of residential districts. By early 1945, the distinction between precision and area had blurred into a single terrifying reality of total destruction. The Allied cooperation, born of divergent doctrines and early failures, had created a machine of war that was biologically impossible to resist. As the smoke finally cleared from the blackened skeletons of the cities, it left behind a landscape that prompted a deeper, more sobering question about the nature of victory and the cost of total war. In the final analysis, the story of the Allied air war is not merely a chronicle of industrial calculation or tactical ingenuity. It is a haunting testament to the terrifying efficacy of a unified front. The American daylight and the British night, one a surgical scalpel, the other a crushing firestorm, were two parts of a single indivisible effort that pushed the boundaries of what civilization could endure and what it could unleash. They achieved a victory that was absolute, yet they left behind a ruin that defies easy moral accounting. The skies above Germany, once filled with the promise of dominance, became the theater where the age of total industrial warfare reached its zenith, leaving the world forever changed by the sheer scale of the destruction. The legacy of these campaigns remains a somber lesson. When nations unite their distinct strengths with singular purpose, they can move mountains or reduce them to dust. We study these shadows not to glorify the fire, but to understand the terrible price paid when the sky itself is turned into a weapon of war.